He arrived without a crowd. No flashes from cameras. No chanting voices. Just the faint, almost imperceptible murmur of London life continuing, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind the tall, grey stone of the High Court. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, stepped out of his car, adjusting his coat, eyes scanning the narrow street, and for a moment, it was just a man walking into a courtroom. But that quiet, almost ordinary scene was anything but. Because the story that was about to unfold inside those walls carried weight, not just for him, but for an entire institution that had spent decades hiding behind headlines, bylines, and the brittle shields of public interest. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It's easy to look at the scene and assume calm, to mistake the absence of a crowd for the absence of significance. But that's precisely the contradiction that makes this story compelling. A prince, a man whose every gesture has been dissected, is now alone in a fight over truth, privacy, and accountability, and the world has yet to catch up to what's really at stake. Why did no one stand outside the court to greet him? Was it weariness from decades of tabloid spectacle? Or something subtler, a sense that the system that once amplified his every move had shifted, and not necessarily in his favor? On Wednesday, the High Court in London became more than stone, glass, and steel. It became a stage for a confrontation that had been decades in the making. Harry gave evidence against one of Britain's most prominent publishers, accusing the company behind the Daily Mail and its sister paper, the Mail on Sunday, of unlawful information gathering. That phrase alone, unlawful information gathering, is heavy with implication. It's not just a legal term. It's an accusation that strikes at the heart of journalistic ethics, trust, and, in some cases, criminality. Harry isn't just suing a newspaper. He's confronting a culture, a network of practices, and an entire industry that has profited for years from intrusion, speculation, and what he alleges is calculated invasiveness. Yet, the publisher has been quick to push back. In a statement released before the trial, the company called Harry's claims preposterous and without foundation. It emphasized that the articles in question, some published 20 or more years ago, were the product of responsible journalism based on legitimate sources. The phrasing is deliberate, defensive, almost measured, but it carries with it a subtle tension. Responsible, legitimate, and yet challenged. The contrast between accusation and defense sets the stage for a trial that promises to be as much about perception as it is about fact. And if there's one thing we know from history, perception can be as potent and as destructive as reality. Consider the paradox for a moment. A man born into one of the world's most scrutinized families is fighting for a private life, claiming that private information was obtained improperly. Yet the very courts in which he pleads his case are public arenas, with proceedings that will be examined, quoted, and reinterpreted long after the gavel falls. How do you reconcile the quest for privacy with the reality of public exposure? And more importantly, what does it mean for the notion of accountability when the systems meant to protect justice are themselves entangled in the media narratives they're supposed to arbitrate? The trial, according to a schedule agreed by both legal teams, will run for more than 2 months, ending on March 26th. Judge Matthew Nicklin will hear the arguments, review evidence, and eventually issue a ruling. But even before the legal conclusion, the courtroom has already become a theater of broader cultural debate. Questions ripple through the public consciousness. Should powerful individuals have recourse against media intrusion? Or is this the natural consequence of their privilege? And how do the principles of free press and personal privacy coexist when lines between reporting and harassment blur? Harry's presence that morning was calm, almost deliberate. He waved to the press, but the wave itself seemed symbolic, an acknowledgement of the media machinery without yielding to it. There was no crowd to cheer him on, no supporters to bolster his confidence, yet the gesture carried weight. It was a subtle reminder. Despite years of exposure, despite relentless scrutiny, the narrative was not entirely controlled by anyone else. For viewers watching from home, this moment offers a stark contrast to the spectacle that usually accompanies royal appearances. No red carpets, no staged interviews, just a man asserting agency in a space designed to test it. And yet, what he was walking into was far from ordinary. The trial is not a casual dispute over words printed on paper. Harry is accusing a major publisher of actively seeking to acquire private information through unlawful means. Actions that, if proven, could have legal and ethical consequences extending beyond this case alone. The allegations suggest a deliberate, systemic effort to access information that should have remained confidential, information that, in the wrong hands, can define or destroy reputations. It's a narrative that asks the audience to confront uncomfortable truths. How much of what we read is legitimately obtained, and how much exists because someone decided the ends justified the means? To understand the stakes, we need to look at the broader history. Harry's life has been, from its earliest moments, a series of public events interpreted by a press eager for every intimate detail. From childhood photos leaked without permission, to the relentless scrutiny surrounding his mother's death, to coverage of his military service and marriage, the pattern has been consistent. Intrusion framed as public interest. But the legal argument he now presents reframes the issue. It's no longer just about prying eyes or tabloids running sensational headlines. It's about deliberate acts of information gathering that overstep legal and moral boundaries. It's about a system that, if unchecked, allows the powerful to exploit privacy without consequence. And here lies a deeper tension: the audience. We, as viewers and readers, are complicit in the ecosystem that sustains this kind of reporting. Every headline clicked, every viral excerpt shared, adds fuel to the cycle. The case forces a confrontation not only between an individual and a publisher, but between public appetite and private rights. What does it mean to consume news responsibly when the lines between reporting and exploitation are blurred? And how do we, as a society, reckon with the power dynamics that determine which private lives are deemed fair game and which are protected? As Harry entered the High Court, the air seemed almost charged with contradiction. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, the proceedings promised a clash of narratives, evidence, and character testimony. For those watching from afar, the drama unfolds in fragments. A wave here, a statement there, a legal argument presented in dense language. But within those fragments lie the elements of a larger story, one about ethics, trust, and the tenuous balance between privilege and accountability. And the question lingers. If someone as visible and scrutinized as Prince Harry is still vulnerable to unlawful intrusion, what does that say about ordinary citizens whose privacy is far less protected? This trial is more than legal maneuvering. It's a slow reveal of mechanisms that shape public perception. Every document filed, every witness called, every objection raised, will feed a narrative that extends beyond the courtroom walls. It is about power, not just royal or institutional power, but the power of media, of influence, of information itself. And the ripple effects could be significant, challenging norms, practices, and perhaps even the assumptions we hold about what constitutes fair and responsible journalism. Yet for all its weight, there's an almost cinematic irony in how the scene is set. The prince waves, the street is empty, and yet the consequences of what will transpire in those 2 months are vast, unseen, and unpredictable. The absence of a crowd may seem anticlimactic, but in that emptiness lies a tension, a quiet stage set for revelation. It is almost as if the universe is holding its breath, waiting to see how power, ethics, and accountability will collide in a space designed to weigh evidence, but also to reflect the values of a society still grappling with the boundaries of privacy. And so, as cameras focus on his figure walking into the courthouse, we are left with a compelling question. How much of what we have witnessed in the press over decades has been informed by lawful reporting, and how much has been the result of deliberate, invasive practices now challenged in court? The implications go beyond Harry, beyond headlines. They touch the very principles that govern information, accountability, and the right to a private life in a world dominated by constant exposure. But even as he takes his seat and the legal arguments begin, one subtle truth hangs in the air. The story we think we know, the story of a prince versus a newspaper, is only the surface. Beneath it lies a network of actions, decisions, and historical practices that have quietly shaped the information landscape for years, sometimes imperceptibly, sometimes dramatically. The tension is palpable, and the anticipation is only beginning to build. And as the courtroom doors close, one cannot help but wonder. If a figure as public and protected as Prince Harry is challenging practices that have long gone unchecked, what hidden truths might surface? What mechanisms of power will be exposed? And what will the world learn, not just about him, but about the forces that have shaped the very way information has been gathered, sold, and consumed? The story is just beginning, and its reverberations will unfold over weeks, perhaps months. Each witness, each piece of evidence, each statement carries weight. Each moment in the courtroom contributes to a narrative that is far more complex than a single lawsuit. It is a narrative about trust, betrayal, ethics, and the human cost of exposure. And as we follow this unfolding drama, the quiet streets outside the court serve as a stark contrast to the storm gathering within, a reminder that sometimes the most consequential events occur in spaces that seem, at first glance, almost ordinary. The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional rustle of papers, the faint tap of a pen against a legal pad, and the almost imperceptible hum of anticipation. You could feel it in the air, an electric tension that seems to settle just before a storm. Prince Harry sat, composed on the surface, but beneath that calm, there was the weight of decades pressing down, a lifetime of scrutiny, intrusion, and relentless observation converging on a single room. Every glance, every gesture, every pause had significance. And in that space, the line between the personal and the procedural blurred in ways most observers could barely perceive. When he began speaking, it was with quiet deliberation, not theatrics. The first words from a witness carry more than factual content. They carry the potential to define tone, establish credibility, and unsettle the opposition. Harry's voice, steady yet subtly edged with restraint, cut through the expected rhythm of courtroom formalities. He spoke of private moments, moments that should have remained unseen, moments that had somehow been converted into public spectacle. But he did more than recount events. He framed them in a context that exposed patterns that, over decades, suggested a deliberate, systemic approach to acquiring information without consent. What is remarkable and disturbing is how normalized these practices had become. Stories that might have been dismissed as routine reporting were, in Harry's testimony, not isolated incidents, but pieces of a larger, methodical effort. He described situations that felt simultaneously mundane and surreal. Invitations to events where photographers lurked at edges, documents reviewed by third parties with unclear authorization, messages intercepted or misdirected, all filtered through the machinery of publication. And the question that hung in the room, unspoken but heavy, was this: if such things could happen to a prince, what chance did an ordinary individual have of remaining private in a world dominated by information extraction? The legal teams presented documents, carefully redacted, yet still powerful. Some dated back decades, when Harry was a child, before he could even contextualize the ways in which his life would be commodified. Letters, notes, internal memos. All ostensibly ordinary, yet each a window into a network of observation that spanned years. And here is where the contradiction deepened. These were documents created and maintained by people whose roles, in theory, were to protect information, to uphold confidentiality. Yet they became evidence that the very structures designed to safeguard privacy had been infiltrated by practices that Harry now described as unlawful. The tension escalated not just through testimony, but through what wasn't said. In court, omissions speak loudly. A pause before an answer, the subtle avoidance of certain details, a hesitation when confronted with a critical question. All these signals were scrutinized. Observers, analysts, and journalists watching remotely could sense the undercurrents. Harry's testimony was precise, calculated, and yet charged with the gravity of lived experience. Each segment of his recollection teased the audience with what might come next, revelations about methods, motivations, and the culture that allowed such methods to persist unchecked. And there was a sense of irony, almost bitter. The very press outlets he accused of wrongdoing were present, not in person perhaps, but through the mechanisms that disseminate information, reporters' notes, digital feeds, and court transcripts that would inevitably circulate. How could one defend privacy when the medium of exposure itself was embedded into the proceedings? It is a question with no easy answer, and one that Harry's case forced everyone in the courtroom, and everyone watching, to confront. The narrative was layered. One moment, it was the human story, a man seeking to reclaim fragments of a private life repeatedly invaded. The next, it was about systemic critique. Patterns of journalistic practice, organizational decision-making, and legal thresholds for accountability. And between these layers existed tension that was almost cinematic in quality. Imagine the juxtaposition: a prince, trained to operate under public gaze, now navigating a space where every revelation, every objection, every cross-examination has dual significance: legal and cultural, personal and societal. As the day unfolded, the courtroom rhythm settled into a pattern. Testimony, objections, documentary evidence, and strategic pauses. But underneath this cadence was a constant undercurrent of suspense. Harry's recounting of past intrusions, combined with the publisher's denials, created a narrative tension that was difficult to parse. On one side, a legacy of journalism portrayed as rigorous and legitimate. On the other, a detailed, personal account painting the same actions as invasive and unlawful. And in between, the audience, us, the viewers, are left to wrestle with ambiguity, to interpret the space between accusation and denial, fact and perception. Direct audience engagement is unavoidable. Consider this: how much of the media you consume, how many stories you read, depend on information obtained under circumstances you might not fully understand. How many narratives are built on truths carefully curated, selectively revealed, or strategically obscured? And if even a figure as prominent as Prince Harry can be subjected to what he claims is systematic intrusion, what lessons emerge for ordinary lives, for digital footprints, for personal boundaries in an age of surveillance masquerading as reportage? There were moments that, on paper, seemed routine, almost procedural, yet they carried immense psychological weight. A document revealed by counsel, a note, a memo, could alter perception in the courtroom with a subtle glance, a question phrased in precise legal language, or a silent acknowledgement by a witness. The audience, conditioned to expect dramatic confrontation, might underestimate the quiet power of these moments. But in legal battles over ethics, privacy, and accountability, the small, seemingly mundane actions often tip the scale more than grand statements ever could. One cannot ignore the layered irony in the courtroom interactions. The publisher had called Harry's accusations preposterous, yet here he was, presenting evidence meticulously catalogued, and every challenge, every objection raised by the defense opened the possibility of uncovering deeper truths. It was a chess game executed at the speed of human testimony, with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate litigation. And observers, analysts, and media scholars watching this trial are acutely aware of this duality. The public spectacle versus the private stakes, the performative legal theater versus the substantive questions about rights and responsibilities. Emotional contrasts were stark. Harry's demeanor alternated between calm reflection and subtle frustration, moments of restraint juxtaposed against flashes of visible strain. There is a rare authenticity in courtroom testimony when a person's lived experience intersects with formal evidence. And here, every statement carried that weight. It is one thing to accuse an institution abstractly. It is another to recount decades of intrusion, of observation, of lives transformed into stories without consent. The audience is forced to confront that tension, to wrestle with feelings of empathy, disbelief, and reflection. Yet, even in this charged environment, there were hints of strategy. Harry's legal team did not seek to overwhelm the court with emotion alone. Each piece of evidence, each narrative turn, was carefully selected to establish a chronology, to draw connections, and to emphasize patterns over isolated incidents. The approach was subtle but unmistakable. This was not a personal vendetta. It was a case built to reveal systemic practices, with Harry's personal experiences functioning as both anchor and lens. And then there were questions left dangling, questions that no amount of testimony could fully resolve. How far back did these practices go? Who else was involved? How many stories, untold or unchallenged, exist outside of public view. The courtroom, in its solemnity, could not answer these questions outright. But the audience senses them, lingering in the pauses, in the interplay between accusation and denial, in the moments when a witness's gaze drifts and a lawyer's phrasing shifts subtly. There is a haunting aspect to this trial that goes beyond the specifics of any individual allegation. It is about patterns of behavior that have remained largely unchecked, about power exercised subtly, quietly, and yet pervasively. Harry's confrontation of these practices is as much about principle as it is about personal restitution. And as the trial progresses, the audience cannot help but speculate. If these methods existed here, in a world observed by millions, what structures allow them to persist elsewhere, unseen, unchallenged? Every observer watching the proceedings, whether from the gallery, a media feed, or from across the globe, carries that dual awareness. The surface narrative of a high-profile lawsuit, and the deeper, unsettling implications about privacy, ethics, and ACC. And then there was the question of motive, subtle but unavoidable. Why pursue these stories? Why gather information in ways that might skirt ethical or legal boundaries? Harry's testimony hinted at financial incentives, competitive pressures, and the desire for exclusive content. Yet it also suggested a deeper cultural norm, an assumption within the institution that certain boundaries were flexible if the outcome was deemed important. For the audience, this revelation was both illuminating and disquieting, a reminder that systemic behavior can be perpetuated not just by individuals, but by the normalization of practices within organizations. The court documents presented that day were significant. Emails, internal memos, notes, and records of communications painted a mosaic of interactions, each contributing to the larger pattern. Some were straightforward, some obscure, but when taken together, they revealed an infrastructure that enabled repeated intrusion. Harry's team meticulously drew these connections, showing how actions, seemingly unconnected, fit into a deliberate strategy of information gathering. The audience, tracing these connections, began to appreciate the sophistication and persistence of the practices under scrutiny. Equally compelling was the interplay between memory and documentation. Harry's recollections were often corroborated by records. His accounts lent context to documents. The documents, in turn, reinforced his testimony. This layering created tension in a very particular way. It made denials appear less absolute and suggestions of pretext more plausible. The courtroom became a space where credibility, evidence, and narrative nuance were constantly being weighed against each other. The audience, in turn, was left to navigate a complex moral and factual landscape, unsure where the truth ended and interpretation began. Irony permeated these proceedings. The publisher, confident in its prior statements, was confronted with decades of methodical testimony that reframed the context of its previous reporting. What had been presented publicly as straightforward journalism now had the potential to be interpreted as part of a systematic pattern of intrusion. The contradiction was subtle but powerful. Legitimacy claimed versus legitimacy questioned, public statements versus private evidence, narrative control versus uncontested exposure. And yet, for all the weight of documents and testimony, the human element remained central. Harry's demeanor reflected both composure and subtle strain, revealing the personal toll of a lifelong battle against exposure. Each example he presented, however technical or procedural, was imbued with emotional resonance, a reminder that legal arguments were inseparable from lived experience. The audience could sense the accumulation of emotional weight, reinforcing engagement and investment in the unfolding story. The session also revealed the strategic pacing employed by Harry's legal team. Evidence was introduced incrementally, patterns highlighted gradually, and narrative threads teased without immediate resolution. This approach ensured that tension remained high, that curiosity persisted, and that each revelation felt consequential rather than perfunctory. The audience was drawn into the rhythm of disclosure, compelled to follow the sequence of events carefully, and left anticipating the next layer of revelation. And just when the session seemed to reach a measured conclusion, a subtle disruption occurred. A previously overlooked document was referenced. Its significance not immediately clear, but its implications quietly profound. Observers noted the slight reaction from the defense, the subtle acknowledgement by the judge, and the brief pause in the room that suggested this could be a turning point. It was a moment that didn't scream for attention, yet its narrative weight was unmistakable. By the end of the day, the courtroom had established multiple threads. Patterns of intrusion, corroborating testimony, documentation, and emotional resonance. Yet the audience was left with a sense of incompleteness, of questions unresolved. The implications extended beyond Harry and the publisher, prompting reflection on systemic ethics, accountability, and the fragile boundary between personal privacy and public interest. And as the gavel signaled adjournment, one thought lingered in the air. The revelations were only beginning. The patterns had been outlined, the groundwork laid, but the deeper truths, the motivations, the networks, the unseen mechanisms, were still waiting to be fully uncovered. What came next would reveal not only the scope of these practices but the lengths to which the forces opposing him would go to defend themselves, and the consequences that would ripple far beyond the courtroom walls. The next day opened with a quiet intensity that was almost imperceptible at first. There was no fanfare, no dramatic arrival, but the tension was present in the air, thick enough to feel, the kind that seeps into every corner of the courtroom. Harry returned to the witness stand with a resolve that seemed to carry the weight of both personal history and institutional challenge. What made this session different was not the testimony itself, but the way patterns were now starting to intersect, revealing a web of practices that went far deeper than previously articulated. Harry began by recounting interactions from his adulthood, periods in which he was navigating his own sense of independence, establishing his family, and trying to separate public obligations from private life. But the intrusion didn't stop. It had evolved, adapting to new technologies, new media formats, and new avenues of information gathering. Emails, phone calls, private meetings, all described in a narrative that was simultaneously calm, measured, and charged with tension. Each revelation added a layer of complexity, painting a picture of a system that seemed to operate continuously, quietly, often invisibly. The defense attempted to frame these events as part of routine journalistic practice: verification, investigation, sourcing, due diligence. But Harry's testimony emphasized a different perspective: the human cost, the repeated crossing of boundaries, the persistence of practices that were often invasive if not unlawful. The contrast created a tension in the courtroom that was palpable. On one side was legality, procedure, editorial justification. On the other, lived experience, emotional toll, and the suggestion of systemic overreach. One of the most striking elements of this session was the introduction of evidence related to media surveillance and information interception. Harry described instances where communications had been monitored in ways that suggested coordination across multiple departments or teams, highlighting an infrastructure that was organized, deliberate, and far-reaching. The audience, whether following through media reports or observing in person, began to understand that this was not a series of isolated mistakes. It was a persistent methodology with real human consequences. Psychologically, the session was revealing. Harry's composure was occasionally punctuated by subtle shifts, tightened jaw, a momentary pause, the way he adjusted his posture. These were small indicators of emotional strain, yet they were also markers of resolve. For the audience, this duality, human vulnerability combined with deliberate strategy, heightened engagement. It underscored that the battle was not only legal but profoundly personal. Every detail presented was more than evidence. It was part of a larger reclamation of autonomy and narrative control. The courtroom witnessed moments of contradiction that intensified the drama. The publisher, which had claimed all prior reporting was based on legitimate sources, faced questions that exposed ambiguities in sourcing and methods. Certain documents, initially presented as routine communications, revealed discrepancies or implied coordination beyond ordinary journalistic practice. Each contradiction amplified tension, suggesting that what had been publicly framed as standard reporting might have involved practices now under scrutiny for legality and ethics. And yet, uncertainty persisted. Not all evidence was unequivocal, and some events were subject to interpretation. The defense emphasized these ambiguities, questioning context, intent, and relevance. But the pattern was emerging clearly. Repeated intrusions, coordinated information gathering, and an approach that prioritized exposure over privacy. For the audience, this interplay between certainty and ambiguity created sustained engagement, compelling them to process nuance, question assumptions, and anticipate the next revelation. Harry's testimony also highlighted the evolution of media practices over time. What may have been tolerated or overlooked decades ago now appeared more structured, more intentional. He recounted periods when private correspondences were accessed, stories were published without consent, and patterns repeated across years, showing continuity in methods and persistence in outcome. This historical layering reinforced the perception of a systemic approach, and the audience could perceive both the scale and subtlety of these operations. Emotionally, the session was layered. Harry spoke without anger, yet each incident carried the weight of personal violation. There was empathy to be felt, a recognition of what repeated exposure does to an individual, compounded over decades. There was suspense, as the audience waited for corroboration, for cross-references, for links between isolated events that together suggested a network of practices. And there was tension, as each piece of evidence had the potential to unsettle long-standing assumptions about journalistic legitimacy, institutional oversight, and accountability. The corroborating testimony of ancillary witnesses added dimension. Each account aligned with elements of Harry's recollection, confirming certain behaviors, reinforcing timelines, and providing context that made the patterns more compelling. The audience began to grasp the depth of the narrative. It was not merely one individual's perception, but a documented history of repeated behavior. The courtroom, in this sense, functioned as both adjudicative space and narrative accelerator. Every statement, every reference, every pause contributed to the unfolding story. There was also the subtle interplay of legal strategy. Harry's team introduced evidence gradually, allowing patterns to emerge rather than overwhelming the room with a deluge of information. This method created a tension that was cumulative, each piece of testimony reinforcing the next, each document connecting to prior statements, building a narrative scaffold that highlighted both the personal impact and the systemic nature of the alleged practices. The audience, whether consciously or subconsciously, was drawn into this rhythm, engaged by the incremental uncovering of truth. Irony remained a constant undertone. The publisher's pretrial denials of wrongdoing contrasted sharply with the testimony and documents presented. What had been framed as responsible, legitimate reporting now appeared, in part, as coordinated, persistent, and invasive behavior. This contrast created an ethical tension, compelling viewers to reconcile public statements with emerging evidence, and challenging assumptions about authority, trust, and the limits of journalistic reach. And then, a subtle yet significant moment occurred. A previously overlooked memo was introduced, its content understated, yet implicating multiple actors across several departments. The courtroom paused, the tension became almost tangible, and observers recognized the potential magnitude of this revelation. It wasn't dramatic in the conventional sense, no shouting, no confrontation. But its narrative weight was immense, signaling the emergence of a deeper, more intricate web of practices than previously understood. By the session's close, the courtroom had shifted from procedural routine to layered narrative tension. The audience had been presented with patterns, corroborations, and subtle contradictions that demanded attention and reflection. Yet the larger story, the motivations, the broader networks, and the systemic mechanisms, remained partly obscured. The unresolved questions ensured sustained engagement. The curiosity gap had been widened, the stakes made clear, and the anticipation of what would emerge next made undeniable. And as the gavel sounded, signaling another pause, one thought lingered over the courtroom and beyond. The patterns were emerging, the evidence accumulating, but the full scope, how far these practices reached, who else might have been affected, and what ethical consequences would follow, remained hidden. What came next would not just reveal more about the specific allegations, but challenge the assumptions everyone had about privacy, power, and accountability in the media landscape. The courtroom had settled into a rhythm, but beneath the procedural calm, tension continued to build. Harry returned to the stand with a quiet intensity that demanded attention, not by volume, but by the weight of decades of lived experience. Every word, every subtle inflection, carried significance. What was unfolding was no longer a mere recounting of incidents. It was the methodical exposition of patterns that had long gone unnoticed or unchallenged. The audience, both in the gallery and following the trial remotely, could feel it, a slow, inexorable tightening of narrative pressure. Harry began by detailing the way certain stories had repeatedly emerged in the press, stories that, on their face, seemed innocuous but, when pieced together, revealed a coordinated approach to private information gathering. He described moments that were seemingly minor: a misdirected call, a photograph captured from a distance, a private event mentioned in passing by an acquaintance. On their own, each might seem trivial. But together, they formed a lattice of intrusion, a pattern that suggested not accidental reporting but deliberate, sustained observation. The legal team strategically highlighted these interconnections, allowing the audience to trace them step by step. One incident referenced another, one document clarified or amplified a previous account. This accumulation was deliberate. It created a slow-burn tension, keeping observers engaged, forcing them to grapple with not only what had happened, but the broader implications for privacy and accountability. It was storytelling layered with legal precision, a rhythm that kept curiosity alive while reinforcing the emotional stakes. The defense, of course, responded. They framed the accounts as routine journalistic practices, emphasizing sourcing protocols, editorial review, and the passage of time. Many of the stories in question were decades old, they argued, and had not prompted complaints when published. But Harry's testimony reframed the context. Legality, they suggested, did not necessarily equate to ethical responsibility. Practices that might have been tolerated or overlooked were, in fact, cumulative, pervasive, and personally invasive. The courtroom was now a space where law, ethics, and lived experience intersected, producing tension that was both intellectual and emotional. One particularly striking moment occurred when Harry recounted the effect of repeated intrusion on his personal relationships. He spoke of private conversations shared in confidence, later appearing in the public domain, reframed, or selectively excerpted to suggest a narrative not of his choosing. The subtlety of these breaches, the way they eroded trust and personal security, was almost invisible in day-to-day life, but when viewed collectively in the courtroom, the impact became undeniable. For the audience, the revelation was both emotional and thought-provoking. Privacy is not just about secrecy. It is about control, trust, and the right to navigate one's life without persistent external manipulation. The corroborating witnesses added further dimension. Their testimony, aligned with Harry's recollections, revealed not isolated lapses, but systematic behavior. Staff members, security personnel, and even former journalists offered context that illustrated the mechanisms behind the intrusion. Documents that initially seemed mundane, internal notes, email chains, memos, were now interpreted as evidence of methodical information gathering. This layered revelation amplified suspense. Each detail, seemingly small in isolation, contributed to the emerging picture of coordinated, long-term practices that challenged both ethical and legal boundaries. As the day progressed, the audience became acutely aware of the subtle contradictions emerging in the defense's narrative. Assertions of responsible journalism were juxtaposed against evidence suggesting coordination, persistence, and deliberate pursuit of private information. The tension did not erupt in dramatic confrontation. Instead, it was revealed incrementally through careful questioning, cross-referenced documents, and the quiet accumulation of pattern and precedent. This approach kept the audience invested, forcing reflection and anticipation without resorting to sensationalism. Emotionally, the courtroom remained a study in restraint and resonance. Harry's composure, interspersed with fleeting moments of visible strain, conveyed the personal cost of decades of exposure. Observers could sense the subtle tension between the legal precision of his testimony and the emotional undercurrents beneath it. Each detail, whether technical or personal, carried weight. The audience, drawn in by the narrative pacing, recognized that what was being presented was not just evidence for a trial, but the reconstruction of a life repeatedly subjected to observation, documentation, and public scrutiny. The incremental buildup was complemented by strategic reveals. One memo, initially overlooked, exposed coordination between editorial teams across years. Another email thread suggested premeditated attention to certain private interactions. These were not sensationalized bombshells in the tabloid sense. They were subtle, procedural, and profoundly consequential. Each new revelation increased tension, forcing the audience to reconsider prior assumptions about journalistic behavior, institutional oversight, and the ethical boundaries of information gathering. And yet, the complexity of the case also underscored ambiguity. Not all evidence was conclusive. Some required interpretation, some suggested intention rather than direct wrongdoing, and some was open to alternative readings. This ambiguity created narrative tension. Viewers were compelled to weigh credibility, interpret motives, and anticipate the next layer of revelation. The slow-burning suspense relied on this uncertainty, forcing the audience to stay engaged as patterns emerged incrementally rather than instantaneously. One particularly compelling element was the historical scope of the evidence. Harry's testimony traced patterns from his youth through adulthood, illustrating continuity in behavior over decades. The audience could see that this was not a series of random intrusions, but a persistent methodology embedded within institutional culture. That temporal layering made the stakes clear. These practices had endured across time, shaped by precedent, habit, and competitive pressures, and they were now being scrutinized with unprecedented rigor. Irony continued to punctuate the proceedings. The publisher's pretrial statements described allegations as preposterous and without foundation, yet the testimony and documents presented created a narrative that was difficult to dismiss outright. The tension between public denials and private. By the session's close, the courtroom had established multiple intertwined threads. The systematic nature of information gathering, corroboration through ancillary witnesses, patterns of intrusion over decades, and the subtle yet powerful emotional resonance of lived experience. The audience understood that the story was far more complex than a simple dispute between an individual and a publisher. It was about ethics, accountability, and the structures that enable private information to be collected, curated, and disseminated, sometimes without scrutiny or consequence. And just as the adjournment was called, one subtle revelation hinted at deeper layers yet to come. A document previously noted but not fully examined promised to expose coordination that reached higher than anyone had anticipated. Observers, both inside and outside the courtroom, sensed the narrative tension tighten. The implications were vast, and the anticipation of further disclosures hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. What came next would peel back the remaining layers of this carefully constructed system, revealing networks, practices, and decisions that had operated in plain sight, but largely UNC. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. It wasn't louder, not in any conventional sense, but the air had thickened with expectation. A slow tension that had been building over prior sessions now seemed almost tangible. Harry's presence carried with it not just his personal story, but the weight of decades of systemic practices converging under scrutiny. Every document, every question, every pause contributed to a sense that something far larger than a single lawsuit was at stake. Harry resumed his testimony, focusing this session on the more intricate methods allegedly employed to obtain private information. These were not the obvious intrusions, the photographs outside windows, the intercepted letters, but subtler, structural mechanisms that had persisted quietly over the years. He described systems of intelligence gathering within the publishing company, networks of contacts, sources embedded in organizations, and cross-departmental coordination. These were strategies designed to capture private details without leaving overt traces. For the audience, the revelation was chilling. Not just for the details themselves, but for the precision and forethought underlying them. The defense countered carefully, emphasizing editorial standards, claims of ethical sourcing, and the legitimacy of their procedures. Yet as Harry detailed the interconnections, inconsistencies in the publisher's prior statements became apparent. Internal documents suggested coordination and planning that were difficult to reconcile with assertions of purely legitimate journalism. The tension was no longer just about isolated incidents. It was about the structure and culture that allowed them to occur repeatedly over decades. The audience could see, almost imperceptibly at first, the cumulative weight of these contradictions. What made the session riveting was the dual focus, the human and the systemic. Harry's testimony highlighted the personal cost, the strain, the invasions, the erosion of trust in his own relationships. Simultaneously, the evidence mapped the mechanisms enabling these invasions, networks of sources, procedural loopholes, and organizational patterns. The courtroom became a space where lived experience and institutional critique converged, and the audience was compelled to track both threads simultaneously. The psychological dimension was striking. Harry spoke with composure, yet subtle cues betrayed the personal toll. Pauses, brief inhalations, the tightness around his eyes. Each moment conveyed the weight of exposure endured over decades. Observers, both inside the courtroom and following remotely, could sense the gravity without it being overtly dramatized. The tension was not manufactured. It was embedded in the narrative itself, unfolding slowly but with undeniable impact. Documents presented were both technical and revealing. Emails, internal memos, and correspondences provided a lattice of interactions, illustrating patterns of coordination and repeated intrusion. Each document seemed mundane in isolation but became significant when linked with others, a misdirected message here, a repeated inquiry there. The audience could see the methodology emerging, the deliberate, systemic approach to information gathering, and the subtle but cumulative effect it had on Harry's life. There was irony in abundance. The publisher had characterized these claims as preposterous, yet the courtroom now bore evidence suggesting persistent strategies that, if proven accurate, extended far beyond routine reporting. Denials clashed with documentation, assertions of legitimacy collided with historical patterns, and the audience was left navigating a landscape of subtle but damning contradictions. Each revelation invited reflection. How much of what appears routine in media practices is structured, calculated, and ethically questionable? Corroborating witnesses strengthened the narrative. Individuals with insight into the operational aspects of the publisher testified about procedures, workflows, and expectations. Their accounts confirmed patterns Harry described, highlighting that these were not isolated lapses but embedded practices. The courtroom became a space where personal experience and procedural evidence reinforced each other, creating a compelling, layered narrative that demanded attention and reflection. Even minor details carried disproportionate weight. A line in an internal memo, a fleeting remark by a witness, a timestamp on a document, all hinted at deeper networks, coordination, and premeditation. The cumulative effect was narrative momentum. The audience was drawn in, compelled to trace connections, anticipate further revelations, and consider the ethical and legal ramifications beyond the immediate case. Tension escalated through omission as much as disclosure. Certain documents were presented in partial form, certain testimonies framed carefully, leaving gaps that invited speculation. This controlled ambiguity was deliberate, creating a sustained sense of suspense. The audience was forced to engage actively, to consider context, and to anticipate connections not yet fully revealed. The slow-burn nature of the narrative amplified both engagement and emotional investment. The temporal scope of evidence added another layer of tension. Incidents spanning decades demonstrated continuity, reinforcing the argument that these practices were not occasional or incidental but embedded within the culture and operations of the publisher. The audience could trace the evolution of methods, the persistence of behaviors, and the systematic approach that underpinned them. This temporal layering made the stakes clear. What happened to Harry was part of a broader, enduring pattern with implications beyond a single lawsuit. Emotion remained a subtle but persistent undercurrent. Harry's composed delivery, juxtaposed with brief, visible signs of strain, underscored the human cost. Each narrative thread, whether recounting private moments exposed or systemic practices revealed, carried emotional resonance. The audience was compelled to empathize, analyze, and question simultaneously. How do personal privacy, journalistic ethics, and institutional power intersect when repeated intrusion becomes normalized? By the session's end, the courtroom had established multiple intertwined threads. Patterns of intrusion, corroboration through witnesses, historical continuity, and subtle but mounting contradictions in the defense's narrative. The audience was left with a sense of anticipation, a curiosity gap that ensured attention would remain high. The unresolved questions about motivation, coordination, and ethical boundaries set the stage for further revelations that promised to expand both the narrative and its implications. And as the gavel fell, signaling adjournment, one thought lingered. The patterns were emerging, the networks becoming visible, but the full extent, the depth of coordination, the scope of ethical compromise, and the implications for broader media practices remained just beyond reach. What came next would challenge assumptions, expose more of the hidden machinery, and push both Harry and the audience into uncharted territory. The next session began with a subtle but unmistakable shift. The courtroom, already steeped in tension, seemed to vibrate with the quiet anticipation of deeper revelations. Harry returned to the stand, carrying the accumulated weight of prior testimony, but also a focused intent to trace the networks of intrusion, the repeated strategies, and the human consequences that had been hinted at, teased, and partially revealed in earlier sessions. The air felt electric, not because of volume, but because every subtle motion, every document, every carefully crafted question seemed poised to unravel layers that had long remained hidden. Harry's testimony turned toward the mechanics of information acquisition itself. He described procedures that, in isolation, could seem innocuous. Inquiries made to routine contacts, journalists monitoring events, notes taken during public appearances. But as he laid these examples in sequence, the courtroom began to see them as more than ordinary reporting. They formed a persistent, coordinated pattern of surveillance. Observers could feel the tension deepen. These were not isolated incidents, but an interconnected system operating over decades, designed to gather private information without explicit consent. The defense countered by emphasizing editorial oversight, journalistic standards, and claims of ethical sourcing. They framed the activity as routine investigation and insisted that nothing was unlawful. Yet Harry's testimony reframed these actions in human terms, repeated invasions that cumulatively eroded privacy, trust, and autonomy. Each incident, he argued, may have been defensible in isolation, but the cumulative effect revealed a systemic disregard for individual boundaries. The audience, whether in the courtroom or following remotely, was forced to navigate the tension between legality and ethics, and to consider what constitutes legitimate journalism in a culture of relentless pursuit. Harry also addressed the evolution of these practices over time. Early incursions, subtle and almost invisible, had grown in sophistication as technology advanced and the appetite for exclusive stories intensified. Emails intercepted, private conversations monitored, and background inquiries made through layers of intermediaries. All were described in a calm but precise manner, emphasizing intent and method. The audience began to understand that this was not happenstance. It was strategic, methodical, and persistent. The slow-burn nature of the revelation amplified engagement, keeping viewers attentive to each nuance. The corroborating witnesses added further texture. Former staff, security personnel, and even peripheral journalists testified to the presence of structured methods, consistent behaviors, and organizational reinforcement. Each corroboration subtly reinforced the narrative. These were not rogue actions by isolated individuals, but practices embedded within the operational culture of the publisher. The courtroom became a crucible where personal experience and procedural evidence converged, offering a multi-layered portrait of intrusion that demanded the audience's reflection. Emotion, though understated, was palpable. Harry's composed demeanor occasionally shifted, micro-expressions revealing frustration, fatigue, or subtle indignation. These moments humanized the proceedings, reminding observers that the legal battle was inseparable from lived experience. Each testimony carried both factual and emotional resonance. It was evidence, and it was a reclamation of personal autonomy. The tension between formal testimony and emotional undercurrent created a compelling dynamic, sustaining engagement while emphasizing the gravity of what had been endured. Legal strategy became increasingly evident. Harry's team introduced evidence incrementally, linking minor incidents into broader patterns. Each connection, each thread revealed slowly, drew the audience further into the narrative. Patterns that might have seemed coincidental were now illuminated as deliberate, consistent, and systemic. The courtroom itself became a map of these interwoven activities, and the audience, following the testimony, could trace the pathways, anticipate revelations, and feel the suspense build. The defense, meanwhile, attempted to deconstruct these patterns, highlighting ambiguities, questioning recollections, and framing incidents as isolated or misinterpreted. Yet, the cumulative weight of evidence, combined with the corroborating testimonies, made the defense's arguments appear increasingly fragile. The audience could sense the subtle shift. What began as a contest of credibility was evolving into a broader inquiry into organizational culture, operational ethics, and systemic oversight. One particularly chilling moment arose when Harry described the intersection of media attention with personal relationships. Private interactions, intended to remain confidential, had repeatedly surfaced in stories, often reframed to suit commercial or editorial objectives. The subtlety of these intrusions, the way they infiltrated personal and family life, highlighted the quiet but pervasive nature of the alleged practices. Observers were left to grapple not just with legal facts, but with the human cost of decades-long exposure. Documents presented during this session added weight without fanfare. Internal memos, emails, and correspondences, initially appearing mundane, became significant when connected to patterns outlined in testimony. Each document illuminated coordination, deliberate tracking, and repeated methods of information collection. The audience, tracing these connections, began to grasp the depth and persistence of the practices under scrutiny. The narrative tension increased quietly but relentlessly, maintaining engagement while deepening the understanding of systemic patterns. Irony continued to thread through the proceedings. The publishers' public statements, asserting the legitimacy of their reporting, were increasingly challenged by evidence showing consistent strategies to acquire private information. What had been framed as responsible journalism was now scrutinized under the lens of systemic coordination, ethical ambiguity, and potential legal overreach. The contrast created sustained suspense. Denials clashed with emerging evidence, and the audience was left to reconcile competing narratives. The session also emphasized temporal continuity. Patterns extended across decades, suggesting not sporadic lapses, but a persistent institutional approach. The audience could see that practices had evolved yet remained consistent in principle, prioritizing story acquisition over privacy, systematically pursuing information, and reinforcing organizational norms that allowed these behaviors to persist. The temporal layering underscored the significance. These were entrenched practices, not ephemeral lapses, and the consequences had affected a lifetime. Subtle revelations punctuated the session. A previously overlooked memo suggested cross-departmental coordination dating back years, implying that multiple actors were complicit or aware. Though understated, the narrative weight was immense. Observers recognized the potential implications. If corroborated, it could redefine understanding of the organization's internal operations and expose ethical vulnerabilities previously unexamined. By the session's conclusion, multiple narrative threads had been established: systemic information gathering, corroboration through witness testimony, continuity across decades, and emerging contradictions in the defense's framing. The audience was left with anticipation, curiosity, and unresolved questions. The slow-burn tension had deepened, ensuring that viewers remained fully engaged and attentive. And as the gavel signaled adjournment, one thought lingered. The intricate networks, the patterns of intrusion, and the hidden mechanisms were only partially revealed. What came next would delve even deeper into coordination, intent, and systemic oversight, exposing layers that had long operated in plain sight yet remained largely unchecked. The stakes, for Harry, for the publisher, and for the broader implications of privacy and accountability, were only beginning to be fully understood. The courtroom reconvened, yet the atmosphere had shifted once more. There was no dramatic entrance, no sudden fanfare, but a quiet intensity permeated the air. Observers could sense it. The slow crescendo of tension, the layering of testimony, the accumulation of evidence that had begun to reveal patterns both subtle and systematic. Harry returned to the witness stand, aware that each word, each pause, each nuance carried immense significance, not just legally, but culturally and emotionally. The audience could feel it too. The story was deepening, and its implications were growing by the hour. Harry began by revisiting the theme of coordinated observation, focusing on examples that had previously only been hinted at. He described instances where routine public appearances were meticulously monitored, not just by individual journalists, but by teams acting in concert. Sources would be placed strategically, correspondences would be cross-checked, and seemingly innocuous information would be compiled, verified, and then framed to create narratives. Each detail, on its own, might appear minor, but the cumulative effect revealed a structured system of surveillance that extended across decades. The defense, as expected, challenged each assertion, questioning context, intention, and scope. They highlighted editorial oversight, ethical standards, and the legality of information gathering, attempting to frame the actions as routine journalism. Yet Harry's testimony reframed these incidents. It was not a matter of legality alone, but the human cost of repeated intrusion, the erosion of trust, and the persistent imbalance between private life and public curiosity. The courtroom became a stage where the tension between institutional justification and personal impact played out subtly but powerfully. A key moment arose when Harry discussed the long-term consequences of these practices on his personal relationships. Private conversations, meant to remain confidential, had been surfaced, excerpted, and contextualized in ways that created public narratives without consent. The subtlety of these intrusions, the quiet, almost invisible ways in which privacy was breached, was highlighted by his calm but precise recounting. Observers could feel the weight. The narrative tension was not manufactured by spectacle, but built on the painstaking accumulation of evidence and lived experience. Documents introduced in this session further illuminated the systemic nature of the alleged practices. Internal memos, emails, and notes, previously viewed in isolation, now appeared as pieces of a coordinated framework. Teams across different departments had communicated, cross-referenced, and documented private information in ways that suggested intent and planning. The audience, following these connections, began to see a lattice of intrusion, reinforcing the notion that these were not isolated incidents but persistent and structured practices. Corroborating witnesses strengthened the narrative. Staff members, former journalists, and ancillary observers provided accounts that aligned with Harry's testimony, confirming patterns and revealing operational methods. Their statements illustrated the normalization,